Welcome, everybody, to day 10 of breaking through matrix programming within us with your energy coaches and energy trainers, Jona Bryndis and
Jeff Casper. Hey, everybody.
We will guide you through how to work with some of your hidden parts, some of your dark parts, some of your invisible or, unconscious parts, your shadow. But don't jump off the boat right here. We're going to show you a way how to work with this constructively and compassionately. And this is one of our most popular modalities really here at transCODES Energy Healing, namely to find ways how you can reframe some of the things that you cannot love about yourselves. Mm-hmm. So we talked about the importance of feeling whole and how this is connected with what we perceive as lovable about ourselves, or what we'd rather sort of sweep under the rug, or what we'd rather not have about ourselves. And this has a lot to do with, how we are perceiving ourselves, and we've also illuminated that. Mm-hmm. But before we go into, how can we truly work with this, I want to greet everybody and thank you for watching.
Yes.
Whether you're live here or watching the YouTube video, please smash the like button. Let us know. Subscribe for the channel. Mm-hmm. Today we've had to do a different time for the recording simply because we were planning on having a birthday party. And so the best way to get notified of these things is through this subscription. Yep. So you get emails when the live is on and what time it's planned for. So anyway, thank you for coming here. When it comes to inner darkness, most people actually go into this really sort of warding off, putting all guards up type of place, because they are afraid of being asked to go somewhere where they're feeling vulnerable, where they're feeling weak or bad about themselves. I want to take this out here because we're not going to go there. All right, we're going to illuminate shadow and its nature, and then show you ways how to reframe this within you so that it becomes easier for you to, accept and claim and own these parts, because as you become able to reclaim them, then you are able to love them again, even if you recognize that there's maybe some refinement or correction needed here and there. But that's, something that is part of the longer process. The initial or pivotal point here in looking at the things about ourselves that we don't like that much is to learn a strategy on how to see it differently so that we don't have to hide it anymore. In energy work, I often see the people's shadow parts, besides being, fragments that we've already talked about before, but I often see them like neglected, abandoned little puppies locked into the basement. I know it's a bit cheesy, but this is really how these parts feel like sometimes from our perspective, because there are some cool aspects to these parts. There's some cool talents hidden in those shadow traits, if you will, but it's very difficult for the person to see that because they have not been willing or daring to look at them. And let's talk a little bit about why we do this. Why do we separate these things out, and what does that do to us? For the most part, the places that get affected by shadow aspects are things that link back into our childhood. They link back to early experiences, meaning those were things that we experienced as very vulnerable, very embarrassing, very shunning or painful, or that we get punished for them. Right. for most of us, it's those parts in us that we associate with a lot of judgment from the outside. Mm-hmm. And this judgment can be anything from like societal, moral type of judgment, all the way to just like what my mother always used to say about other people, or, you know, what my siblings get punished for. Okay, so it's not always a direct negative experience. It can also be the fear of the punishment or the negative experience if we actually allow this to come forward. And there is the problem. And this problem really applies to all fragments within us. When we shut things down, when we lock things up, when we repress things, when we disconnect from certain parts of us, we cannot really do this without shutting other parts down as well. And so over, you know, a lifetime, really, you know, doing this without being fully aware of this, we're creating this like orphanage of things down in our basement, or, you know, if you will, skeletons in the closet, you know, that have so many cool lessons and so many really cool skills that we had to shut down along with this. And why am I saying this? It's pretty simple. If you look at the nature of the shadow, so the nature of the shadow is to protect you, okay, either from a painful experience or from, you know, making a fool of yourself or getting punished. All right, it's therefore something that your ego develops, you know, to keep you in a place of staying functional, being able to cope with things. All right, and a lot of times those are pretty cool skills that are coming forward through this. So let's take, for instance, the word resilience. You know, resilience is a very good example for a generally positive trait. Mm-hmm. However, you know, if someone gets too resilient, say, then they also become dissociated and they become harsh or cold because, you know, life has made them so rough, you know, that they cannot really connect with softness anymore. So you got to understand that there's things that we neglect along with, you know, sort of what's perceived as a flaw, what's perceived as a negative trait. And then that leads to us not really being able to understand, you know, how some of our life's stuckness, you know, how this programming that we have, how this could be related to certain skills that we simply can't access because we have created this layer of repressed shadow stuff. Now, shadow does not always mean dark. Okay, so a lot of people associate darkness and evilness with shadow. This is not the case, really, neither from a psychological nor from an energetic standpoint. The energetic view allows a little wider definition, you know, because for us it's kind of like a logical thing. Where there's light, there's shadow, you know. So where there's a lot going on, there's also a lot that can go wrong, right? And so naturally, and we see this a lot here in our practice, that people who have a lot of energy, they also tend to have the hardest time with accepting their own shadow traits because, you know, they're really trying so hard. They have this intention and these higher vibratory goals, and they really can't you know, come to terms with some of their perceived shadow traits or aspects, as we call them. And let's be a bit more practical about this and make some examples. What are some of, and Jeff, you are kind of like our shadow work expert here at transCODES. What are some of the most common examples that you observe, you know, like for what people perceive as their shadows?
Typically it's their low expressions, their low vibratory expressions of certain things. So they perceive, you know, guilt sometimes. They perceive fear, the patterns around that. They perceive their judgment of themselves and others. They get all these things in there. So it gets all kind of mixed up in all their, all around. So it's kind of hard to say one, but there's multiple versions of that where you can go into, like, let's say, a shadow trait that I used to have is that I felt guilty for almost everything. That everything that was around me was my fault, and that, it was never done right. So this pattern that I had was constantly pushing towards, taking the blame for everything.
Okay, this is confusing for me. If I've never, if I would have never heard anything about shadow work, I would not understand that. How can you, feeling guilty for everything, be a shadow trait?
Well, because it keeps me out of the light. It keeps me out of the truth. So by doing that, what happens is I begin to basically take blame for everything that's even not mine. So then it gets me further and further into guilt and fear, and then I never actually go for what is mine. I go for what everybody else thinks. So I get stuck in pleasing.
Okay, so what you just what you were observing is that a lot of people have shadow traits that they don't actually identify as shadow traits, and then they have shadow traits that that may not even be shadow, but they perceive them as flaws.
Yes, right.
So the tricky part with shadow is that the way we perceive ourselves, that it influences how we judge ourselves. And just to make this clear, this whole layer of shadow, whether we perceive, this trait, like, say, being able or being too controlling, say, or being too pleasing, or being too judgmental, or being too angry, or whatever it is that we come up with at first, okay, we cannot really be sure that this is actually a shadow trait. This may just be part of our inner negativity. So if you include all of that, and just agree to seeing shadow as all the parts that are not quite visible for you, because they are based on your ego's false perception.
Right.
And the ego's false perception, once more, it was created in the first place to protect you, to allow you to survive, to allow you to cope. So in other words, when we look at shadow traits, what we're really looking at is a combination of all our coping patterns that we have, be it, triggered by outer things or not. It doesn't really matter. If you reframe this into a more neutral thing about yourself and say, okay, there are things that I more or less compulsively do, and it's really tough, even though I don't like them about myself, to let go of it. I can't believe that I keep doing this. Then you're pretty close to getting, sort of where that hidden part of you is located. And I have a practical tip for you, and that is, there's a connection between what we don't like and what we hate, or what we judge, or what rubs us the wrong way in others. Is usually a very good indication of where your shadow traits are located. It's almost like we are specialists in identifying, the very things that we don't love about ourselves in others, as a justification, to not look at our own. And this is quite a big sort of reframing here, because if this were really the case, and by the way, yes, it takes one to see one. This is why we're so good in shadow work. If this is really the case, then this may actually help you, like so many people before you, to completely sort of shift your perspective about what you judge about yourself, what you cannot love about yourself. All, of course, with the goal to go into this balance and wholeness within that allows you to become accountable, to own, and to reclaim your inner higher power. So without that, it will be very difficult for you to accomplish that.
Yeah, because it's usually what's out there is you vilify the shadow. That's what we're kind of taught, to vilify it, to make it bad, to make it evil, to smash it even further. And then what happens is you begin to face it, as you begin to integrate, as you begin to love those hidden parts, those lost parts, those painful parts, those not so nice parts, whatever you want to call that, you actually begin to get each piece back. Every time you do that, every time you embrace the pleasing pattern that I had, the anger that I sometimes can come up, whatever you have for your patterns, you begin to become more whole. You begin to come more into your heart, because that's the pathway, is to walk into the shadow.
Yeah, and so it really dawns or begins to dawn on us that, that shadow has a lot to do with our addictive structures, because the very nature of our shadow, the part that we don't want to face, the part that we try to avoid, the part that we try to hide from an energetic point of view, has the exact same signature as any kind of addiction, which is why we tend to look at the coping patterns underneath the shadow. But just sort of neutrally regarded, a shadow is like an addiction, and therefore it is very difficult for us to let go of, even if we're completely aware of. So a big part of the reframing process that we suggest for looking at some of the things that we cannot love about ourselves is to look at the payoff part. I don't understand why I keep doing this, even though I don't want to do this, or even though this is something that is really not conducive for me. Then you are starting to understand the power that the ego has over your system, because it's like an addiction, so to speak. But there always is a little bit of a cue if you are willing to go into this place of honest self-reflection, namely asking yourself, well, okay, I may not understand why it's there or where this is coming from, but what do I get out of staying there? Like taking the example that Jeff mentioned earlier about pleasing. What is the true nature of that? I mean, the pleasing is just the thing that people see on the outside, right, Jeff? But what was the actual shadow part about that?
Well, there are many shadow parts about that, but a lot of it was the fear underneath of actually trying to express what I wanted to really do. That was too afraid, so I avoided by pleasing. Another one, pleasing, was to get approval, to get acceptance. So a lot of times when I went into pleasing, I went into, by doing something for someone else, they accepted me. So
you expected something back?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And what happened if you didn't get that?
When I was younger, I would try harder. When I got older, I got angry.
Okay. So it is the anger, actually, that is the shadow aspect that you will perceive. You will see that. You will see yourself getting angry. You will feel yourself having disdain. You will feel yourself going into revenge, maybe secret revenge.
Oh, that's passive aggressive all the way.
Yes. So you will see those parts. You may not fully understand that it is, the missing part here, the missing ability to set clear boundaries, the missing ability to express your true needs, the fear of exposing your true self, the fear of being vulnerable that is underneath it. You don't need to understand that in order to work with your shadow. All you really need to see is what is the payoff. It's just like with any substance addiction or other behavioral addictions, is that there's got to be something in it or else I wouldn't do it, right? And the ego is very clever in that way. And not to picture it as the bad guy here, but the ego is very tricky, and it plays directly into what instantaneously strengthens you or helps you to get by, helps you to get through, whatever the challenge is at the moment. So when we're talking about shadow, really we're talking about those really clever coping mechanisms that are unconscious to ourselves. Yep. And so when working with this, I really want you to understand that it doesn't really matter so much where it came from. It's really more important to look at, how much of your energy actually is wasted on trying to keep up a facade, on trying to keep up things that aren't even true to you. All right. And what you could use this energy for if you didn't have those secrets to keep, or if you didn't, have to stay in the fear of being found out, or if you didn't have to constantly seek for approval, or constantly have to control your environment or other people. What could you do with all this energy? Okay. So the reason why we're talking about this here today is because this is a huge part of matrix programming.
Yes.
In fact, the entire matrix is based on that. Whether you believe in conspiracy theories around that or not doesn't matter. It is really easy to control people, to keep them low, to keep them act like addicts if all you need to do is to trigger their shadows all day long. And that keeps people in this state of being unable to love themselves, of being unable to become accountable, unable to understand their full potential and to access, their true talents, and unable to move into sovereignty. In other words, the best way to keep somebody low is to keep reminding them on their shadow traits, and they'll never break out. So that's why we need to address this here when talking about breaking through matrix programming. Yes, that's correct, Denise. All to get them into the same place, to keep them busy with crisis, to keep them busy with victimhood, with disdain, and all that. That's, to work through that is part of shadow work.
Because if you watch the TV or the news for half an hour, you watch any type of program, mostly on TV, your ego's getting pings. Every time there's a victimhood program, if you've got a victimhood pattern, it's getting a ping. It's getting a hit. It's just like the addict said, like Jona talked about. If you've got anger and you see justification, you see revenge, you see people getting back at each other, your ego loves it. It goes into, yeah, that's exactly what I need. And then it just constantly plays. So it's by dissociating from that, or not dissociating, from disconnecting from that, and by looking within and beginning to see where these patterns are at on you, you can begin to take the ties away.
Yeah, so it's not really about an objective, like this behavior or that behavior. Right. We all sort of want to know, is this good or is this not good? We want to know what is, like the law or like religions that tell you exactly what's good or bad. It's not about that. It's about understanding that your shadow gets triggered whenever you go in a place or when you're exposed to a place that pings, that triggers your vulnerability. And then your false self takes over, produces a different version of you, that is much better or much different. And that requires you to push in a lot of energy that over time you can't hold that up. And then it backfires on you. And this is usually when you find yourself in the middle of being caught in your shadow. And on the screen here, you see common precursors for shadow traits. And I really want to make or point out that shadow traits have a lot to do with the energy balance that we can keep. And if there's, crisis, like sudden grief, pain, or victimhood, and those things are all things that can trigger, these shadow aspects, such as poor self-image and self-pity. Those are all shadow aspects. Most people don't see this as a shadow trait. They see this as, like victim specialist, so to speak, getting really good in victimhood. But getting really good in victimhood is a form of denying your true self, is a form of fragmenting yourself. And shadow really is only the way this happens for you, namely in the hidden and often invisible for you. So repressed anger, control mechanisms and specialness, those are like very common triggers for our shadow traits to come forward. So I want you to understand that the way we are contextualizing shadow here is not in a moral sense. It's in an energetic sense. In other words, every time you're incongruent, you are on your way to your shadow coping. Okay, so how do you change that? Okay, so we'll give you homework and we'll give you practical implementation tips here in a minute. But I want you to understand that why we have this structure here that we are proposing to you in this 21-day energy training framework, and that is in order to overcome certain layers of your ego that are harder for you to see at first. We had to sort of retrain your system, okay? And the very process of shifting out of your darkness is the very process how you shift out of persistent programs, persistent patterns. Okay, so there's no difference really. Shadow is just one variation of it. So first you have to build your heart connection. You really have to find that safe place within you. And we did this on day 1 and 2. And then you got to go into, or be willing, be willing to be more compassionate with yourself and maybe let go of some of the judgment that you have towards yourself, but especially becoming open to look at some of the hidden or repressed stuff. And we did this here in day 3 to 5. And then comes the part where you really need to start working, consciously working with some of these aspects that you cannot fully love about yourself, like we did then, from on day 6, where we reframed, all our different ways of perception and basically prove to ourselves that, the way our ego perceives reality is actually distorted or filtered or untrue. So it's a form of accepting, that maybe just a little bit the way I've been seeing myself in the world is not exactly how it is. So that then lays the foundation to actually, become active in your self-healing, where you take an inventory, where you're willing to honestly self-reflect, where you're willing to become the observer instead of only the experiencer, which then leads you to this point here, and that is beginning to own, beginning to become accountable for yourself, and also feeling the empowerment to reclaim your whole self. All right. So that's sort of behind looking at the shadow aspects at this very moment. I want to point out that there is a variation of shadow, which is called the white shadow, that is a lot harder to identify. We spend a lot of time here at transCODES working with the white shadow. Most of us find it easy to identify the dark shadow aspects, but the white shadow part is what is actually socially accepted or even promoted. So that's why Jeff mentioned the pleasing, because pleasing actually seems to be like a socially accepted type of thing, right? That's a good thing, right? But from the individual's perspective, it's actually not. So it's the reason why the majority of humans conform. It's the same reason, and why it's so difficult to break out of this sometimes. Okay, so that's why we brought this up. White shadow is something you'd have to read up on. There's lots of articles on the transCODES website about that. So coming to the practical implementation here. Okay, so on the physical, it's first important to tune into this fearlessness that we talked about in the past couple of days, and to really go in and say, okay, what is it actually that I'm afraid of? Let's say it's I'm getting punished, or I'm getting as an adult now, I'm getting embarrassed. Okay, so let's just face that fear for a moment and ask ourselves, what does it feel like when I go into this vulnerable space? Where do I feel this in my body? What if they find out? Where do you feel this? Do you feel this in your stomach? Do you feel this? Like, what goes on in your body there? Because this will help you later to identify this quicker before it can latch on. On an emotional level, you ask yourself, okay, here we're dealing with coping patterns, we're dealing with addictive patterns. So what is my shadow addiction? Do you know? Is it the proverbial gallon of ice cream that when you go low emotionally? Or is it that you become angry at the world, or that you yell at your spouse, that you make others responsible? How does that really feel when you are caught in your shadow? What can you identify for yourself emotionally, the state that you're in? I can tell you, or share with you from my personal perspective what it's been in my situation for most of my life, and that was that people would somehow, find out that I may not be as confident as I appear.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big one for me. So I figured out early in my life, that if you have a good stance and if you can, present something with just enough sort of, posture, then, you can get what you want. But what if people find out, that I'm actually really vulnerable underneath? So anything that would make me look vulnerable, especially as a woman, was a sort of a no-no. And that led me to a lot of different shadow behaviors, shadow coping mechanisms.
Right.
So it's the feeling part. I want you to feel into, like, what is it that you're really afraid of? Mm-hmm. For me, it was being afraid of that other people find out that I'm actually not as strong as I appear. Okay, I'm giving you a lot of weapons here. Like I still feel
that. You're okay.
No, I still feel that. I was like, what the heck are you saying? You were actually telling them, how to take you down. All right, so you see, this is you're dealing with very deeply ingrained patterns within you, and I just want you to feel into the emotion of that. Okay, mentally. This kind of the mental implementation of working with your shadow leads us back to the ego story, and remember how we debunked our ego perception. So meaning that a lot of our ego story is really just part of justification and part of a distraction, maybe. When it comes to the ego story in regards to our shadow traits, you will find yourself justifying and defending your shadow traits. And that's kind of like what you can use to get a little closer to this unconscious part. Here at transCODES, within the Sacred Self-Healing Program, we literally ask people to write down their sob story. What is your sob story? The suffering of your life. And by writing this down, like unfilteredly, and looking at it from the perspective that we've just offered you, a lot of things become aware to you. Yes. Socially and behaviorally, there is a way to get closer to uncovering and also sort of taking away the gravity and the fear from working with your darkness, if you actually learn the discipline of sharing some of your secrets or some of these hidden parts. So just like how I shared something with you right now, this is a discipline that I've developed over decades, and it's liberating.
It is.
So for you, as part of your homework will be to find one thing that you have never shared with anybody, kind of like a secret or whatever, even if it's just reflecting on your shadow parts, and share this with someone.
It's one of the most powerful techniques, because once you start getting it out there, it's almost like you feel this weight of all that hiding, all that need to protect, all that need to defend. It starts to kind of go away, and you can feel that weight leave. And you'll also begin to realize this is one of the most powerful things. Everybody has a shadow. Everybody has. If you sit down with 10 people and you all talk for a few minutes about what your shadow is, you're going to see a lot of similarities.
And you're going to have a lot of fun doing that too. So that's reframing right here,
Yeah.
So you take it out of the basement, you illuminate it, and then all of a sudden, hey, wow, that's not even that bad. And wow, I have that too. And oh my God, you do the same thing. Yes, ha ha ha. Yeah. I mean,
it's extremely relieving.
It's a bit simplified, but it is extremely relieving. And that's where the healing part comes in, and with that you lose the fear of being vulnerable in the first place.
And you're not alone. You realize immediately, and you're not. Everybody has this, so you're not alone. So that's the coolest part about this. When you begin to face it and go into it, you'll begin to see it in everybody else, including yourself.
Yeah. One of the things that you can do energetically here is if you have already develop a little bit of a feeling for when you feel energetically strong and when you feel energetically low, is to observe how, when you do your shadow thing, whatever that is, your ego coping, is to watch what that does to your energy, because it really does wear you out. It really does pull you down. In fact, this is what you will later find out, what makes you susceptible to outer energies attacking you or trying to latch on or even absorbing them. It's when you are caught in your own ego, shadow, coping, false self, addiction. Okay, I'm using all these words here almost in the same context because they all work into another. All right, so another good reason to pay a lot of attention to your congruence, because energetically your shadow and your coping makes your energy very vulnerable to the outside. So the very thing that you're afraid of is actually produced by trying to hide things or distracting from things or repressing things. Yes. And so, for a lot of you, the biggest process now is to become more aware of these hidden things, all right? So it's not, let's just take all the judgment and the fear and all that out of the picture and really just focus on becoming better at identifying those patterns. Because later you'll find out that if you can get a grip on that, then you can really make, huge progress in regards to your personal liberation. All right, that's very, very important. And you'll find out that this is sort of a key part of your journey, in regards to your physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health and maturity. Before we let you go, I just want to make a few more practical examples so that with your homework you feel a bit more confident to work with the energy work technique that we're introducing with this energy training lesson, and that is reframing. So, everything that you do right now can have a positive and a negative side, okay? And if we look at it from the perspective of the emotional state that we are in, there's always a positive and a negative expression to it, right? And so here you see a list, on the left side, the positive response, the positive expression of that, and on the right side, the negative, the more contractive type of response. And how you can, reframe them. So let's say if you look at the right side, you find yourself that you have a hard time with boundaries. You find yourself, constantly maybe in the place where other people violate your boundaries, okay? Then, this may be surprising to you, but this has something to do with anger. And a positive expression would be to learn how to set more clear and healthy boundaries. You can't do that, though, if you cannot see the shadow aspect, the payoff that is coming out of allowing other people to continue doing that. Same with, avoiding responsibility. Why is it that we blame others? Why is it that we prefer to be a victim? Because then we don't have to take responsibility, right? So that would be the shadow trait. So just to give you a little bit of a few markers that you can use to work with this. I would like to close with really pointing out to you how much energy is wasted with feeding the darkness, feeding this shadow, distracting, hiding, withholding, repressing, and how that can be a tremendous shift for you if you can, truly face this. And the last thing here that I want you to contemplate about is it takes an enormous amount of talent to create those intricate shadow aspects that we have in coping mechanisms. Can you find the true talent that is underneath there for yourself? Can you find a way to realize that your shadow trait is really just a cool talent gone rogue? taken over and gone rogue. And the example for that is in many of your guys' cases, your energetic sensitivity as such. Most of us energetically sensitives learned very early in our lives that this is, something cool thing, because it can make us manipulate people. It can also keep us safe, right? Because we can sort of see things before they arrive. We can already feel them. But if this was never really reflected on and always just used sort of for the sake of surviving, of getting through, then chances are that you have begun to misuse your energetic sensitivity to project or to manipulate others. And that's now manifested as your shadow.
Yep.
Just a little tip here. And the homework for today is coming up with a list, a list of triggers, maybe a list of payoffs, or even if you are familiar with this already, with the understanding of that, a list of what are potential talents underneath these misused type of skills. All right. And the transmission work here at transCODES that corresponds with it, of course, is our shadow work, one of the most popular energy training sessions, but also all of our remote healing circle workshops. They train our ability to face our vulnerabilities on all different levels, and they're really, really cool. It's energy sessions with live webinar right afterwards where everybody shares. So this is, like, for me personally, one of the most effective energy training modalities is to go into experiencing something and then to share this together and learn how to face some of these vulnerabilities together.
Yep.
Right. Tomorrow, we're going to see each other, or we're going to see you guys again at the same time. I literally have to look at my list here. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about witnessing. So this is a step further than just observing, and how we can tune into this place in us that really allows us to let go of our judgment and align us to neutrality. Thank you again for coming, for watching here. Don't forget to push the like button. I love your hearts in the live chat. So those of you watching the edited video, you can't see that. Yes. So thank you, everybody, for coming. See you guys tomorrow, 1 p.m. U.S. Denver time, talking about witnessing. Bye-bye.